The content of the essay is, Cowboy gives his blanket to a freezing Apache girl. The next day, her tribe says he just married her. What started as a simple act of kindness would trap Boone Cartwright in a situation no amount of gunfighting skills could solve. But as the wind howled through the canyon that night, all he could see was a young woman dying in the snow. The storm had been brewing for days, transforming the mountain pass into a treacherous, ice-laden gauntlet. Boone Cartwright hunched deeper into his worn leather coat, urging his weary horse onward through the mounting snowdrifts. He'd been relentlessly pushing for the trading post, hoping to outpace the storm's fury. The biting cold pierced his thick gloves, and each breath formed ephemeral white plumes against the gray sky. Suddenly, a figure caught his eye. A small, huddled form pressed against the base of a massive boulder, barely stirring. Initially, he dismissed it as a snow-covered animal seeking respite from the blizzard. But as he drew closer, the shape solidified into something undeniably human. It was a young Apache woman, appearing no older than 19, huddled miserably in a flimsy deerskin dress that offered scant protection against the unforgiving cold. Her lips were tinged with an ominous blue, and her entire frame trembled violently. Boone dismounted without hesitation. He had witnessed enough death during his years on the frontier to recognize its chilling approach. The woman's eyelids fluttered open as he approached. Deep, intelligent eyes met his, reflecting not fear, but a profound sense of resignation. She possessed a striking beauty that resonated deep within him. Yet, at this moment, survival was her only need. Memories of saloon tales flooded his mind, stories of merciless Apache raiders and the relentless violence that stained the landscape wherever they clashed with settlers. The unspoken laws of the frontier, warning against assisting the wrong individual, echoed in his thoughts. But as he gazed down at her fragile form, those warnings seemed distant and inconsequential. Boone retrieved the thick wool blanket from his tightly packed bedroll. It was his most prized possession, his sole shield against the frigid nights on the trail. Woven years ago by his grandmother, just before the fever stole her away, the faded blue and gray pattern still held warmth like no other fabric he owned. Without uttering a word, he gently wrapped the blanket around the shivering woman's shoulders. Surprise flickered across her face, as if an act of compassion from a white man was the most unexpected event. Her cold, stiffened fingers gripped the edges of the blanket with desperate gratitude. "You'll be all right," he said softly, uncertain if she understood his words. The woman's breathing slowly became more regular as warmth gradually seeped back into her body, restoring color to her pale cheeks. She intently studied his face with those penetrating dark eyes, and in that shared moment, an unspoken connection formed, eluding their full comprehension. Boone assisted her to her feet and guided her to a sheltered area behind the rocks, where they were more protected from the wind. He meticulously built a small fire, sharing the meager rations he carried. The woman, indicating herself and softly uttering, "Ayana," ate slowly, her gaze never wavering from his face. It was as if she were etching every detail into her memory. As the blizzard raged around them, they sat in comfortable silence. Boone found himself stealing furtive glances at her, wondering about her history. How had she become stranded alone in such a fierce storm? Where were her kin? But such questions would have to wait. As the first light of dawn painted the horizon, Ayana rose and carefully folded the blanket. She offered it back to him, but Boone shook his head. The worst of the cold had passed, and he still had his heavy coat. She needed it far more than he did. Her eyes widened at his refusal. She spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing between the blanket and herself, then pointing at him. Her tone was urgent, almost distressed, but Boone couldn't decipher her words. He simply smiled and swung himself onto his horse. "Keep warm," he called back as he rode away, believing he had performed a simple act of kindness and would never see her again. However, as Ayana watched him disappear into the mist-shrouded landscape, she clutched the blanket tightly. In her culture, such a gesture held a far deeper meaning than the well-meaning cowboy could ever fathom. And before sunset, her people would arrive seeking answers, setting in motion events that would irrevocably alter both their destinies. Boone reached the trading post by mid-afternoon, his thoughts preoccupied by the encounter with the Apache woman. There was something haunting about those dark eyes, the way she had looked at him when he refused the blanket, almost as if she was attempting to warn him about something ominous. The trading post was nestled in a secluded valley, sheltered by towering pines, with tendrils of smoke curling from its stone chimney. Inside, a wave of warmth washed over him. 3 men were huddled around a rough-hewn table, engaged in a card game and nursing glasses of whiskey. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Murphy, glanced up from cleaning his rifle. "Boone Cartwright," Murphy acknowledged, placing his weapon aside. "Didn't expect to see you till spring. This storm damn near killed my horses," Boone replied, unbuttoning his thick coat. "Got business in Santa Fe that can't wait." Murphy poured him a cup of coffee, the dark liquid releasing a plume of bitter steam. Boone wrapped his chilled hands around the tin cup, savoring the return of feeling. The warmth brought Ayanna to mind again, and he wondered if she had found safety. "See any trouble on the trail?" one of the card players asked, a gaunt man with nervous eyes and a prominent scar slashed across his jaw. "Apache have been moving through these parts. Folks are getting jumpy." Boone hesitated, the coffee suddenly tasting metallic in his mouth. He considered mentioning Ayanna, but an inexplicable force held him back. These men wouldn't understand. They would only perceive the threat, not the frightened young woman who had been close to death from the cold. "Nothing I couldn't handle," he replied finally. The scarred man leaned back in his chair. "Smart to keep moving. Last week they hit a wagon train 20 miles south. Took everything. Left the bodies for the buzzards. Animals, the whole lot of them." Boone's jaw clenched tightly. The word animals echoed in his mind as he recalled Ayanna's grateful smile. Whatever those raiders had done, she was not one of them. She was simply a woman who needed help. Murphy refilled his cup. "You can bunk here tonight. Got a room in the back, but I'd ride out at first light if I were you. Been hearing drums in the hills. When they start drumming, trouble's not far behind." As if summoned by his words, a rhythmic drumming filled the valley, a low, steady pulse like a primal heartbeat. The card game ceased. Every eye turned toward the windows, though the view offered nothing but the darkening sky. "There it is again," the scarred man whispered. "Been going on for hours." Boone placed his cup down, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The drumming seemed to emanate from all directions, encircling the valley. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, like a conversation spoken in a language he couldn't understand. "Maybe they're just passing through," Murphy suggested, but his hand unconsciously drifted toward his rifle. The drumming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was more oppressive than the sound itself. Boone's thoughts returned to the blanket, to the desperate urgency in Ayanna's voice. Had she been trying to convey something vital? "I'll take that room," Boone said, finishing his coffee in one gulp. But as he settled into the narrow bunk that night, sleep evaded him. The drums had resumed, closer this time, and within their rhythm, he thought he could discern his name being called. Outside his window, shadows danced among the trees. Not the erratic movements of animals, but the calculated advance of people who knew precisely where they were going. People who were searching for someone. And deep in his gut, Boone knew they were searching for him. Dawn arrived too soon, the silence unsettling. The drumming had ceased sometime before sunrise, leaving an unnatural stillness that made Boone's skin crawl. Even the birds seemed to fear singing. He dressed quickly and went outside to check on his horse. The animal was restless, its ears twitching at sounds imperceptible to human ears. Murphy emerged from the trading post, rifle in hand, his weathered face etched with worry. "They're out there," Murphy said quietly. "Been watching us all night. Haven't seen them, but I can feel their eyes on me." Boone scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, yet the sensation of being observed was palpable, like standing at the wrong end of a loaded rifle. He saddled his horse, his movements deliberate and calm. Panic would only exacerbate the situation. "I'm riding out," Boone announced. "No point staying here if they want something." "You're crazy," the scarred man said from the doorway. "They'll pick you off before you reach the ridge." But Boone was already mounted. Whatever was unfolding, hiding would not resolve it. He would rather face it openly than be cornered like a rat. He guided his horse slowly up the trail, hands visible and away from his weapons. The morning mist clung to the valley floor, creating an ethereal, dreamlike scene. The horse's hooves echoed off the canyon walls, the only sound disrupting the heavy quiet. Then they materialized. 7 Apache warriors emerged from the trees like shadows brought to life. They did not rush forward or brandish weapons. They simply appeared and waited, blocking the trail ahead. Their horses were adorned with war paint, yet the warriors themselves were composed, almost ceremonial. One of them, an older man with elaborate beadwork on his shirt, raised his hand in a gesture of undeniable command. "Stop!" Boone reined in his horse, his heart hammering against his ribs. These were not raiders. Their posture was formal, non-threatening. The older Apache spoke in his native tongue, his voice resonating with authority. Behind him, the other warriors remained still, their dark eyes fixed on Boone with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. Then, from behind the group, another figure emerged. Ayanna. She wore the same deerskin dress, but Boone's blue and gray blanket was now draped around her shoulders like a ceremonial robe. Their eyes met, and he saw something that made his blood run cold. Not fear or gratitude, but responsibility. A heavy, inescapable burden. The older Apache spoke again, and this time Ayanna translated, her English carefully enunciated but carrying a musical accent. "My grandfather says you have claimed me as your wife," she declared simply. Boone's horse shifted beneath him, sensing his shock. "What? I never... The blanket," Ayanna continued, her voice gaining strength. "In our way, when a man gives his blanket to protect a woman, he declares his intention to provide for her always, to be her husband." The words hit Boone with the force of a physical blow. He stared at the blanket, his grandmother's blanket now transformed into something he had never intended. A marriage contract woven from wool and good intentions. "That's not what I meant," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I was just trying to help." Ayanna's grandfather spoke again, his tone brooking no argument. Ayanna translated, her voice smaller, more vulnerable. "He says intentions matter less than actions. You saved my life and claimed me as yours. Now you must honor that choice." The canyon walls seemed to close in around Boone as the magnitude of his situation became devastatingly clear. A simple act of kindness had bound him to a woman he barely knew, in a culture he did not understand, with consequences beyond his imagination. Boone's mouth went dry. 7 pairs of eyes watched him, waiting for an answer that could determine whether he lived to see another sunset. The morning air suddenly felt thin, each breath a conscious effort. "I don't understand your ways," Boone said carefully, his voice echoing. "Where I come from, giving someone a blanket just means you don't want them to freeze to death." Ayanna's grandfather, whom she called Nish, listened to the translation and responded with what sounded like a question. His weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes held the sharp wisdom of a man who had survived by reading the hearts of others. "He asks if he would have given the blanket to an Apache man," Ayanna translated, her voice barely above a whisper. The question cut straight to the truth. Boone considered it honestly. Would he have stopped for an Apache warrior? Would he have risked his own warmth for someone who might have been his enemy? The answer sat heavy in his chest. "Probably not," he admitted. Nish nodded, as if this confirmed something he already knew. He spoke again, his words flowing smoothly, ancient and certain. "He says you chose to see me as a woman first, Apache second. This shows honor, but honor carries responsibility." One of the younger warriors shifted restlessly on his horse, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. Boone caught the movement and felt sweat trickle down his spine despite the morning chill. These men were not merely here to converse. They were here to enforce their customs, whatever the cost. "What happens if I refuse?" Boone asked, though he suspected he already knew. Ayanna hesitated before translating. The conversation that followed was rapid and intense, with several warriors joining in. Boone watched their faces, trying to decipher the emotions behind their words. When they were finished, Ayanna's face was pale. "If you refuse, you dishonor not just me, but my family. My grandfather would be obligated to..." She paused, searching for the correct English words. "To restore our honor through blood." The threat hung in the air like the acrid smoke of a funeral pyre. Boone looked at each warrior in turn, seeing the unwavering resolution in their faces. They were not bluffing. In their world, this was non-negotiable. Then he looked at Ayanna. He really looked at her. She stood straight and proud, but he could see the fear she was trying to conceal. Fear of what would happen to him. Fear of the repercussions for her family if violence erupted. Fear of being trapped between two worlds that failed to comprehend one another. "There has to be another way," Boone said finally. "Some trial or test I can undergo instead." Nish's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his stoic facade. He spoke to Ayanna, who appeared surprised by his response. "He says you speak like a warrior, not a coward. This is unexpected." She paused. "He will consider your words. But first you must come to our village so you truly understand what you are choosing." The young warrior who had been fingering his weapon spoke harshly, obviously disagreeing. Nish silenced him with a sharp glance and a terse rebuke. "My cousin believes you should be forced to choose now," Ayanna explained. "He thinks you will try to escape if given time." Boone met the young warrior's hostile stare. He could see the barely suppressed violence simmering within him, the desire to resolve this conflict with blood rather than words. One wrong move, one sign of disrespect, and this canyon would transform into a battlefield. "I give you my word," Boone said, addressing Nish directly. "I won't run." As Ayanna translated, Boone realized he had committed himself to something more perilous than a simple marriage proposal. He had agreed to enter an Apache village, surrounded by individuals who possessed every reason to despise him and to confront customs and trials beyond his comprehension. But as they began riding deeper into the mountains, a single thought persisted. He was no longer solely trying to save his own life. Somehow, inadvertently, he had become responsible for safeguarding Ayanna's as well. The Apache village materialized from the landscape as if a mirage had solidified into reality. It was nestled in a sheltered valley between towering red cliffs. It was larger than Boone had anticipated, with dozens of traditional dwellings scattered along the banks of a clear stream, smoke rising from cooking fires and the laughter of children echoing off the canyon walls. But as their group approached, the laughter abruptly ceased. Faces materialized in doorways and from behind trees. Men, women, and children, all watching the white man who rode among their warriors. Some expressions betrayed curiosity, while others barely concealed their hostility. Boone felt like a wolf venturing into a sheep pen, although he was unsure who was the true predator. Nishi led them to the heart of the village, where a large fire pit was surrounded by logs arranged in a circle. An elderly woman emerged from the largest dwelling, her silver hair braided with turquoise beads. Her eyes, sharp as obsidian, locked onto Boone with an intensity that made him want to look away. "My grandmother," Ayanna said quietly. "Imala, she is not pleased." Imala spoke rapidly to Nish, her voice escalating with obvious anger. She gestured toward Boone repeatedly, her words cutting through the air like knife blades. Other villagers began to converge, forming a loose circle around the fire pit. "What's she saying?" Boone asked. Ayanna's face flushed with embarrassment. "She says you smell of whiskey and violence, and that bringing you here puts the entire village at risk." She paused. "She also says I have brought shame upon our family by accepting gifts from a stranger." The crowd swelled, becoming more agitated. Boone could now discern individual voices, some arguing, others making demands. A young man about Boone's age pushed forward, speaking directly to Ayanna with obvious passion. She shook her head repeatedly, but he persisted. "Who's that?" Boone asked, although the jealousy burning in the man's eyes made the answer clear. "Kuruk. He has asked for my hand many times." Ayanna's voice was barely audible. "He says this is a trick to avoid marrying him." Kuruk stepped closer to Boone, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. He spoke in heavily accented English, but the words were clear enough. "You take what is not yours, white man. Leave now, or I will cut out your lying tongue." The threat sent a ripple of tension through the crowd. Boone felt the weight of every eye upon him. One wrong word, one aggressive action, and this situation would explode into violence, destroying any possibility of a peaceful resolution. "I didn't take anything," Boone said calmly. I gave something. There's a difference. Karuk's face darkened. You gave nothing. You twist sacred customs for your pleasure, then run back to your people. Before Boone could respond, Imala stepped between them. She spoke sharply to Karuk, who reluctantly retreated, although his gaze remained fixed on Boone. She then turned her attention to her granddaughter, her voice laden with disappointment. Ayana's shoulders slumped as she listened. When Imala finished speaking, tears glistened in the young woman's eyes. She says I must choose, Ayana whispered. Either prove your intentions are honorable by completing the marriage trials, or admit I was foolish and accept Karuk's proposal instead. Boone felt his stomach drop. The marriage trials? What kind of trials? 3 tests, Ayana explained, her voice growing stronger. Strength, wisdom, and sacrifice. If you fail any of them. She didn't need to finish the sentence. The alternative was etched on the hostile faces surrounding them. Nish spoke again, and the crowd fell silent. His voice held the authority of the law itself. He says the trials begin at sunset, Ayana translated. And if you try to leave before they're completed, Karuk has permission to hunt you down. Boone surveyed the circle of faces, some hopeful, others eager for his downfall. But it was Ayana's expression that ultimately decided him. Behind the fear and uncertainty, he saw something that reminded him why he had given her the blanket in the first place. She was worth protecting, worth fighting for, even if he didn't fully comprehend why. Then I guess we better get started, he said. As the sun descended behind the canyon walls, casting long shadows across the valley, the entire village gathered around the central fire. The dancing flames painted the redstone cliffs in shifting patterns of light and shadow, transforming the peaceful valley into a primal, ancient arena. Boone stood at the edge of the circle, watching the Apache prepare for what felt more like a funeral than a wedding ceremony. Nish approached, carrying 3 objects: a thick rope, a piece of carved wood covered in intricate symbols, and a small leather pouch that jingled softly with each step. He placed them near the fire and began to speak, his voice carrying over the crackling flames. The first trial tests your strength, Ayana translated, standing beside Boone. You must climb the sacred cliff face using only the rope, reach the eagle's nest, and bring back a feather. Boone gazed up at the towering wall of stone that rose behind the village. Even in the fading light, it was nearly vertical, offering few handholds and dotted with loose rock. The eagle's nest appeared as a dark smudge about 60 feet up, impossibly high and perilous. Men have died attempting this, Ayana added quietly. Even our own warriors sometimes fail. Karuk stepped forward, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. He gestured toward the cliff with open contempt, implying that the white man would never succeed where Apache warriors had faltered. He says you will fall like a stone, Ayana translated, that your soft hands have never held anything harder than a whiskey bottle. The insult stung because it contained a kernel of truth. Boone possessed considerable strength, but rope climbing wasn't exactly a common skill for cowboys. Still, he had found himself in tighter spots before, or at least he hoped so. He removed his coat and hat, feeling the evening chill bite at his skin. The rope was made of rough hemp, worn smooth in places by previous climbers. As he tested its strength, he could feel the collective weight of every eye in the village bearing down on him. The first 20 feet proved easier than he expected. His arms and shoulders burned, but years of ranch work had endowed him with a strength he didn't know he possessed. The rope cut into his palms, drawing blood, but he continued climbing, one hand over the other, his boots scrambling for purchase on the treacherous cliff face. Halfway up, his luck ran out. A section of rock crumbled beneath his feet, sending him swinging free on the rope. The crowd below gasped, and someone, perhaps Ayana, cried out. His shoulders screamed in protest as they bore his entire weight. For a moment he hung there, spinning slowly, looking down at the faces below. Karuk was smiling, anticipating his imminent failure, but it was Ayana's expression that fueled his ascent. Not fear, but fierce determination, as if she were scaling the cliff herself through sheer force of will. Finding purchase, he continued his ascent. The eagle's nest loomed above him, a tangle of sticks and bones perched on a narrow ledge. As he reached for it, a massive golden eagle exploded from the shadows, talons extended and wings beating violently around his head. He ducked, nearly losing his grip as the bird screamed its fury. Its talons raked across his shoulder, tearing his shirt and drawing blood. But there, ensnared in the thorny branches of the nest, was a single, perfect feather. Boone snatched it and began his descent, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. Each foot downward was pure agony, but he refused to relinquish his grip. When his boots finally touched the ground, his legs buckled, and he collapsed to his knees. The village erupted in surprised murmurs. Even Karuk looked stunned that the white man had prevailed. Boone held up the eagle feather, its golden-brown surface gleaming in the firelight. Nish took the feather, examining it carefully before nodding his approval. He spoke briefly, and Ayana translated, relief evident in her voice. "He says the eagle fought you, but you persevered. The first trial is complete." But before Boone could catch his breath, Nish picked up the carved wooden piece. It was covered in intricate symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. "The second trial tests your wisdom," Ayana said, her voice strained. "You must solve the riddle of the ancestor stone before the fire burns down to embers." Boone looked at the symbols, then at the fire. It was large now, but wood burned quickly in the dry mountain air. He had perhaps an hour, probably less. "What happens if I can't solve it?" he asked. Ayana hesitated. "Then you will have failed 2 trials." She didn't finish the sentence, but the answer was written in Karuk's eager expression. Failure meant death, and success seemed increasingly unattainable. As Boone stared at the ancestor stone, struggling to decipher symbols that were indecipherable, a single thought dominated his mind. How can you solve a riddle when you do not even speak the language? Boone turned the carved stone over in his bloodied hands, studying the symbols that seemed to mock him with their ancient secrets. The fire crackled lower, each spark that extinguished bringing him closer to defeat. Around the circle, villagers whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads as if his failure were a foregone conclusion. The symbols were unlike anything he had ever encountered. Some resembled animals, a bear, an eagle, and what might have been a snake. Others suggested natural elements, mountains, rivers, the sun, and moon. However, the connections between them, the story they told, remained as impenetrable as the cliff he had just scaled. "Can you give me a hint?" Boone asked Ayana desperately. She shook her head, genuine sorrow in her eyes. "The wisdom trial must be completed alone. To help you would dishonor both of us." Karuk spoke from across the fire, his voice dripping with triumph. Even without a translation, Boone knew he was declaring a premature victory. Several villagers nodded in agreement. The fire continued to diminish. Time was running out. Boone forced himself to change his perspective. Perhaps the solution did not lie in deciphering Apache symbols, but in understanding universal truths. Every culture had stories, patterns that repeated throughout time and across different places. He scrutinized the stone again, seeking familiar elements. There, in the center, was a spiral, possibly representing the cycle of the seasons. Around it were the animals he had identified earlier, but now he noticed they were arranged in a specific order. The bear positioned where the sun would be in summer, the eagle where it would be in spring, and the snake where autumn would fall. "Seasons," he murmured. "It's about the seasons." However, that couldn't be the entire answer. There were other symbols, other elements that did not fit the seasonal pattern. A figure resembling a person standing at the center of the spiral, lines radiating outward from the human figure to each animal. Then it struck him. Not just seasons, but the relationship between humans and nature throughout the seasons. The bear representing summer, when they hunted for food to store. The eagle representing spring, when they needed its strength to build and grow. The snake representing autumn, when they prepared for the coming winter, shedding old ways like a snake sheds its skin. And winter, there in the 4th position was a symbol he had previously missed. Not an animal, but something that resembled a blanket or shelter. Something that provided protection and warmth when the world turned cold. His heart began to race. This wasn't simply a riddle about the seasons. It was about his story, his journey to this place. "The riddle isn't asking what the symbols mean," Boone said aloud, his voice carrying across the now silent circle. "It's asking why I'm here." He stood, holding the stone toward Nish. "Each symbol represents a choice. The bear, the choice to take what you need by force. The eagle, the choice to soar above the suffering of others. The snake, the choice to abandon your responsibilities when times get hard. He paused, looking directly at Ayanna. And the blanket, the choice to provide warmth, even at your own expense. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, but Nish held up his hand, halting the trial. He spoke rapidly to Ayanna, who looked stunned by Boone's answer. He says you understand that wisdom isn't about knowing our symbols, but about knowing yourself, she translated. The ancestor stone shows the 4 paths a man can take when faced with the suffering of another. You chose the path of the blanket. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Even Karuk seemed surprised, but Nish was not finished. The second trial is complete, Ayanna continued. But grandfather says the third trial is the most dangerous. It tests not your body nor your mind, but your heart. Nish picked up the leather pouch, and the clinking sound seemed ominous in the near darkness. When he opened it, Boone saw it contained small bones, finger bones carved with even more symbols. The trial of sacrifice, Ayanna whispered. You must choose what you're willing to lose to gain what you claim to want. As the bones were scattered across the ground in patterns only Nish could interpret, Boone realized that surviving the first 2 trials might have been the easy part. What lay ahead would require him to confront the one thing he had been avoiding since this began, what he truly desired and what he was willing to pay to obtain it. The bone casting seemed to stretch for an eternity. Nish studied the configuration with the intensity of a man reading life and death in fragmented pieces. The village held its breath as he finally spoke, his words heavy with the weight of ancient law. The bones have chosen the sacrifice, Ayanna translated, her voice barely audible. You must give up the thing you value most in this world. Only then can you claim what you seek. Boone felt a chill that went beyond the mountain air. What if I don't know what I value most? Nish smiled grimly, gesturing toward Boone's horse, still saddled and waiting at the edge of the village. He then pointed to the gun belt around Boone's waist. Finally, his finger settled on the faded photograph tucked into Boone's shirt pocket, an image of his parents, his only remaining connection to family. He says a man always knows, Ayanna whispered. The bones will reveal what you try to hide from yourself. Karuk stepped forward, speaking rapidly and gesturing toward the scattered bones. His tone was challenging, almost mocking. Several other villagers nodded in agreement with what he was saying. My cousin says this is foolishness, Ayanna explained, that no white man would sacrifice anything of real value for an Apache woman. He believes you will choose to leave rather than give up what matters most to you. Boone looked at each item. Nish had indicated. His horse represented freedom, the ability to wander, to be untethered. His gun symbolized protection, the power to defend himself in a hostile world. And the photograph, his past, his identity, his final link to who he had been before this moment. Yet, as he stood there, surrounded by faces illuminated by dying embers, Boone realized something that surprised him. None of those things felt as important as they had yesterday. The horse was merely an animal, the gun merely a tool. Even the photograph, cherished as it was, represented people who were gone. What truly mattered was the present. What truly mattered was the woman standing beside him, caught between worlds because of his actions. I know what I must sacrifice, Boone said quietly. He reached into his shirt and removed the photograph. His parents gazed back at him from the faded paper. His father, stern and proud. His mother, gentle and kind. For years, the image had been his anchor, reminding him of his origins and who he was supposed to be. However, clinging to the past prevented him from embracing the future. Boone walked to the fire pit, kneeling beside the glowing embers. I sacrifice my old life, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the village. The man I was, the plans I had, the world I knew. I relinquish it all to become the man Ayanna deserves. He placed the photograph on the coals. The paper ignited immediately, curling and blackening as his parents' faces disappeared into the smoke. The loss struck him deeply, but he remained steadfast. The village erupted in murmurs of astonishment. Even Karuk appeared taken aback, but it was Ayanna's expression that mattered most. Wonder, and something deeper, resembling the first stirrings of love. Nish spoke again, his voice expressing a respect that had been absent earlier. "He says you have proven yourself worthy," Ayana translated, tears streaming down her face. "Not because you have completed the trials, but because you have understood their true meaning. Strength without wisdom is futile. Wisdom without sacrifice is meaningless." Imala, who had been so hostile, approached Boone with a soft deerskin shirt decorated with intricate beadwork. She spoke softly as she presented it. "She says, 'Welcome to our family,'" Ayana whispered. As Boone donned the shirt, he felt a change within. The cowboy who had entered the valley no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had chosen love over freedom, connection over independence, and the future over the past. Kuruk approached, his earlier animosity replaced with grudging respect. He spoke to Boone in English. "You fight like Apache," he said simply. She chose well. As the village celebrated around them, Boone took Ayana's hand. The blanket, his grandmother's blanket, still lay across her shoulders. However, its meaning was different. Now it was exactly what the Apache had seen. A promise, a commitment, and a choice to put someone else's warmth before your own. "Do you regret it?" Ayana asked softly. "Giving up your old life?" Boone looked into her dark eyes, seeing his future. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the life he had chosen. And sometimes he realized the best decisions were made with the heart instead of the head. "The only thing I regret," he said, pulling her closer, "is that it took me so long to understand the true meaning of that blanket." As the celebration continued, Boone knew tomorrow would bring new challenges. Learning Apache customs, finding his place in this community, and building a marriage based on respect rather than circumstance. But tonight, with Ayana's hand in his and the blanket across their shoulders, he felt like he was home. So, what started as a simple act of kindness, offering a blanket to someone in need, blossomed into something far bigger and more meaningful than Boone could have ever imagined. It's a reminder that sometimes, the most unexpected detours lead us to the most profound destinations. This story really highlights the beauty and complexity of human connection, and how even a small gesture can ripple outwards, changing lives and forging bonds that transcend cultural differences. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What resonated with you the most? Have you ever experienced a moment where a simple act had unexpected consequences? Leave a comment below. I'm really eager to hear your take. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any of our upcoming adventures.